Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with pianist and organist Ben Paterson. He was born and raised in the land of Coltrane, Philadelphia, then moved on to Chicago for 10 years and has spent the last 2 years in the jazz mecca of the universe, New York City. He wove together some interesting tales of his time with Vaughn Freeman in Chicago, a recent tour with Bobby Broom and Steely Dan, some great revelations, and much more. Please dig it, my friends.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just dive right in here and kind of get an idea of what has been going on with you lately.
Well, let's see. So what's been going on with me lately? Well, I'm in New York. I've been in New York for about 2 years or so now. I moved here from Chicago, where I lived for about 10 years. So, I've been here for 2 years in New York, but it's still, depending on who you talk to, that's either a long time or an incredibly short amount of time. But it's going well. I mean, New York's keeping me really busy. I'm out gigging just about every night or around town somewhere or other. I'm leading my own groups here and there. I have a piano trio as well as an organ group, which I run at various venues. And then I do a lot of sideman work too, just working with a lot of different singers, different horn players. But pretty much mostly around sort of the straight ahead jazz scene. Mixing in a little bit here with some more blues-based groups or some more funk-based groups, but mostly doing swinging straight ahead kind of stuff. So that's keeping me pretty busy. And then I'm also working on a new CD. I've got an organ trio CD I recorded back in January with one of my longtime drummer friends from Chicago named George Flutist on drums, and of course the great Peter Bernstein on guitar. So I'm sort of doing the mixing and mastering for that and figuring out how I'm going to put it out. But so that's my latest recording project as well.
Right on. So I want to go back to your lineage of your life. You grew up in Philadelphia, the home of Coltrane. What was it about living and growing up in that city that fostered either a love of music or a love of jazz for you?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, Philly, as you say, is one of the great homes of the history of music. I mean, you look down the list of all the greats of jazz music, and it's kind of crazy actually how many of them came out of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And I did have some jazz experiences down there for sure. Although I really didn't get out and really start playing a whole lot until I made it to Chicago. So it's funny, I actually don't know a whole ton of people on the Philly scene. But I do go down there quite a bit these days, visiting my parents. They still live there. And growing up, I did definitely get some influences from the city. I took along a lot of classical lessons when I was a kid at a place called Settlement Music School, which is a sort of Philly institution. I had a great teacher there. But then I kind of started playing jazz by backing up some singers. My stepmom, for one, she sings in musicals and does jazz tunes, and I kind of, when I was, still early in high school, started picking out songs behind her. And then I kind of got more and more into the jazz thing, and there were a couple places that I got into early on. I remember there's a place called the 23rd Street Cafe, which is kind of a funky little spot that has a jam session every Tuesday. I used to go down there and sit in and play with those guys. I remember going down to Ortlieb's, which is sort of a famous old Philly jazz club. Hearing guys like Mickey Roper and who else did I hear down there? The pianist named Sid Simmons, so I used to hear down there sometimes. So I didn't do a whole lot of playing while I was living in Philly, but I definitely did get out into the city a little bit and start to see for the first time kind of what live jazz was all about,
Yeah, so when did you start playing piano?
Started playing classical piano when I was about 6 years old, and I did that all the way through high school. And I started playing jazz probably when I was about, I don't know, maybe 13 or 14. I started getting into some of those tunes. And I can remember there was the NPR station in Philadelphia, WRTI. I don't know if they still do it or not, but they used to play jazz in the evening times. And I can remember there was a DJ named Bob Perkins he had this great announcer's voice. He used to say, "This is BP with the GM," meaning Bob Perkins with the great music. And I can remember him playing all kinds, listening to Oscar Peterson and Art Tatum and guys like that coming through the radio on his program. So that kind of into my bloodstream too.
Yeah, we had a guy here in Kansas City for years that I used to listen to that did a show on NPR at night, and it was indisposable for the amount of encyclopedic knowledge I got of jazz and all these cats. It's good, man. Sometimes when you're doing things like that, you think you're operating in a vacuum, but you're actually really kind of opening up a very big Pandora's box for people, which is great.
Yeah, you underestimate how much influence those guys can have. Without
a doubt. So when did the organ get thrown into the mix?
Well, the organ I kind of started doing when I was in Chicago. I mean, it's strange. Even when I used to play piano, I had a tendency to always kind of walk a bass line for myself with my left hand. I think I just wanted to kind of feel that swing of a quarter note bass line. So I used to do that on piano. And then I met a guitarist when I was living in Chicago. His name was Guy King. And he's originally from Israel and was mostly a blues guitarist, at least at the time. And I kind of started working with him on some of his blues gigs. And I remember he sort of came to me one day and he said, hey, it's always been a dream of mine to have an organ trio and, kind of get into all this Wes Montgomery and Kenny Burrell, Jimmy Smith, Jimmy McGriff kind of repertoire. So he kind of pushed me or encouraged me to explore that. And we went out and found myself an organ. And I started studying with this great organ player from Chicago named Chris Foreman, who's still one of my absolute favorite players on the instrument. I mean, I hear all kinds of great players out here in New York, but Chris really has like a certain special something that I really haven't found anywhere else. I mean, he's just got a particular groove and a particular style that I absolutely love. So I started working with him, and then this guitar player, Guy King, I mean, he just put together a great organ trio. Like I said, we do a lot of Wes Montgomery, Kenny Burrell stuff, but then coming from the blues scene, he also sang. So we would do blues tunes, we'd do Ray Charles kind of stuff. And it was a great trio. We probably worked together maybe 3 or 4 nights a week for about 3 years or so. So I definitely, through him, got a ton of organ experience under my belt, mostly just working with him.
It's the tuba of the piano world, for sure.
Right.
So let me ask you this. When you were a kid, what did you dream about becoming when you grew up?
Ooh, that's a good question. If I can remember back that far. I mean, it's funny, I think later on, it's hard to tell sort of when, when the music thing really got going and when I sort of started to really sort of take it seriously. But when I talk to people who knew me back when I was a kid, they tell me I was already pretty much on the music path, even at a pretty early age. So I think, when I was a kid, I mean, music was always part of my life, and I was, kind of a ham when I was a kid. I remember putting on, little shows, and I used to do a lot of impressions of celebrities and stuff, and I think being some kind of performer was definitely always in my head as something that I wanted to be when I grew up. And then music just kind of fit right naturally into that, and I can remember early on when I sort of started to play and I started to think, I'm not bad at this. Maybe I could actually, make a living at it. I didn't end up going to school for music. I got into a great school, and at the University of Chicago, and figured I'd go and study some different things. And I remember my parents saying, well, you might find something you like even more than music, which is perfectly smart. But my time in Chicago and at that school only sort of reinforced the fact that music was what I wanted to do.
So you moved to Chicago. What was that kind of change in your life like, coming from, Philadelphia into an environment like Chicago? What kind of experience was that for you?
Well, Chicago's a great city. I mean, I lived there for a long time, and I still miss it. I'm actually going back in a couple weeks for a quick visit. But it was great. I mean, when you go to college, it's sort of your first time off on your own. So a lot of it was just kind of exploring being in a new city and being in school and kind of living off on my own and just enjoying all of that. But the University of Chicago it's a great school academically, but it's also positioned in Hyde Park, which is a really cool neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. And it's kind of surrounded by a lot of different musical influences. There's a lot of jazz happening around there. To this day, when I go back and do shows in Hyde Park, I mean, those are some of the best jazz audiences you're going to find anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I play a show down there, and people know the music and they really respond to it. And there's a real sort of historical connection with jazz and blues. So I think being surrounded by, in that neighborhood and being surrounded by that kind of culture definitely led me down that particular path. Some of my first gigs I remember doing all around the south side of Chicago with guys that I met, not necessarily through the university, but at jam sessions and gigs that were happening around the university. So being in Chicago and particularly on the south side definitely threw me into a city and a neighborhood that had a strong appreciation for jazz. So that definitely influenced me, I would say.
And you got to log some quality hours with the great Vaughn Freeman. What was it like to learn from him and play with him?
Oh man, playing with Vonsky was pretty amazing. I mean, I definitely miss that guy. He's been gone about 3 years now, maybe 3 or 3.5 years. And yeah, part of the reason I stayed in Chicago as long as I did was to keep playing with Vaughn. I mean, he was Vaughn was absolutely one of a kind. There was nobody else that sounded like him or that talked like him or I mean, he was truly one of a kind and had lived through so many different eras of the music. I'll say one thing that was a great learning experience was just trying to comp for him when he was soloing, because Vaughn was liable to do absolutely anything at any moment. I mean, he'd grown up, you know, with the swing bands and Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins and all that, and then he, you know, played with Sun Ra and went through all that stuff in the 60s and 70s. And so when we'd play a song, it didn't matter what the song was, from one phrase to the next, he was liable to jump from some crazy avant-garde, you know, Sun Ra stuff to some completely sweet, bluesy, melodic, Coleman Hawkins kind of stuff. And so, he just had the whole history of the music inside him and could jump from any point to any point at any moment, and then do it all with his own unique sounds and his own unique kind of style. And he was just such a sweet guy. I mean, when he took me into the band, I was pretty young. I think I was 23 or 24, something like that. And you know, I had some experience under my belt, but I was still a relative newcomer to the scene. But he heard something in my playing that made him want to pick me up, and so he just grabbed me and he didn't baby me. He threw me right into the water. He'd basically just start playing songs on gigs, you know, whether I had heard them before or knew them or not. It was basically up to me to just hear the changes and figure them out on the bandstand, which was, you know, slightly intimidating, but was, you know, that's the way the old guys did it, and that's a great way to learn this music.
Yeah, sometimes you just need a little bit of luck in life, huh?
I guess so. Yep. And I mean, when you were asking about, you know, what it was like being in Chicago and being on the South Side, that's where I met Vaughn. In Hyde Park, I wasn't that far from his regular Tuesday night jam session down on 75th Street, so I could just slide on down there from Hyde Park, and you know, I was only a 10-minute drive away from one of the greatest, you know, living jazz saxophone players.
Yeah. That's cool, man. So you made your pilgrimage after 10 years, a full decade Chicago, and come on to New York. Yeah. What was that like? You kind of, you know, they always say Chicago is kind of the little New York. You go to the actual Big Apple. What kind of culture shock, what kind of, you know, tremors did that create in your geography, in your tectonic plate, so to speak?
Yeah, that was a tough, I mean, you know, I'd thought about moving to New York for years and years, but again, Chicago's a great town. It was really tough for me to leave. I had a ton of friends there. I had good gigs. You know, I was playing all the time and had a nice little apartment. I mean, Chicago was great. And actually Chicago, I loved there's even just a stylistic thing with all the blues elements and the blues scene that exists in Chicago that really influences the jazz scene there. And I really miss that, actually. But you know, I just had to come check out New York and see what was happening. And it was tough. I moved here with no gigs. I didn't have, you know, anything on the books when I came here. But I found kind of a cheap room that I took over from a friend of a friend and just sort of dove in and started going to, you know, 3 or 4 jam sessions / gigs every single night and just bouncing from club to club to club. And that you can only really do in New York. I mean, Chicago has great musicians and great players, but I can go to a little spot in the West Village in New York, and within a 5-minute walk from one subway train, I can go to 8 different jazz clubs. with all of which have, 2-3 bands a night and jam sessions running until 3 or 4 in the morning, and you just can't really find that anywhere else. But at the same time, New York is tough. There's an incredible number of musicians here, both coming out of schools and just moving here from all over the world. So there's kind of a pretty big sort of oversupply of players, and not all of them are fantastic. I mean, you're surrounded by the best of the best, but you also, have to kind of fight your way through these, the large numbers of musicians who are all here trying to kind of do the same thing. So I don't know. New York is definitely, it's a challenge, but it's also very inspiring. You're surrounded by really pretty phenomenal players. I mean, yesterday I was at this new club in the Village called Mesro, and I got to go check out Ron Carter and Ethan Iverson in this beautiful little room with a gorgeous Steinway, and I could sit 10 feet away from them and just sit and listen, So I don't know. New York was a challenge to move here, but I think it was definitely the right move. It's something that I don't regret at all. And I think I'm not sure how long I'll stay. I might end up being here for just a couple more years, or I might end up spending the rest of my career here. It's really hard to tell at this point.
What would you consider one of the biggest periods of creative growth in your life?
Well, I'd say two. I'd list two periods maybe as being particularly memorable in my life. One was, and I already sort of mentioned this, when I was in Chicago and I was just starting to play the organ and working with that guitar player, Guy King. I mean, before that, I was into Oscar Peterson and I was playing a ton of piano, but when he kind of picked me up and we started running this band, that definitely brought a lot of different influences into what I was doing, because he was coming from this whole blues scene with guys like Albert King and B.B. King, who of course just passed away yesterday. And so he kind of pulled me into this group and we did all this Ray Charles stuff, and those were influences that I was sort of aware of, but hadn't really checked out that much. So with him throwing me on the organ and then kind of sort of pointing me in that direction, I was able to absorb all this blues and soul kind of stuff that is music I always loved, but that was a real period of growth for me for sure. I mean, Guy King himself is a phenomenal musician, and then so just he kind of put me in this band that at a really high level and was playing all this new music that I was able to absorb in a very natural kind of way. So that was definitely a huge period of growth. That was, I guess, around 2009, 10, 11, a couple of years around there. And then the other one I would have to say is these last couple of years in New York. I mean, coming out here and being around all this phenomenal music and just experiencing so much music. I mean, I spend my days doing rehearsals or practicing or checking out tunes. And then in a given night, I mean, if I have a gig, I'll go play. I might go check out a club beforehand. I might go to some after hours thing afterwards. I mean, just the amount of music you can check out here is pretty incredible. And then there's another musician out here who's been an incredible help to me and a huge influence too, and that's a pianist who I have the highest admiration for, whose name is Johnny O'Neill. And Johnny's, I mean, also a one-of-a-kind guy. He grew up in Detroit, playing a lot of gospel stuff, but he's been, in New York for a while now, played with Art Blakey and Ray Brown and I mean, all the best. And he's just a phenomenal player. He's got all these incredible, like Art Tatum kind of harmonies, and he sings too, and he just has one of the best feeling swing feels you've ever heard in your life. And he's really been great to me out here in New York. He's kind of taken me under his wing, and he calls me his piano player, because I'll come up on his gigs and play piano while he stands up and sings. And so, these last 2 years in New York, playing all these different gigs and spending that time hanging out with Johnny has also been a great period for me.
Yeah. Was there ever really an album, a jazz album for you that just parted the curtains, that made everything kind of open up in a brand new way for you?
That's a tough one too. I mean, I think probably the first album that caught me back when I was in high school that made me really kind of just sort of fall in love with this music was maybe it was Night Train by Oscar Peterson. I mean, that to me just had the combination of this beautiful, beautiful swing feel, incredible technique, a huge, huge dose of blues. I mean, that whole album is just dripping with blues, basically. All that great bass playing by Ray Brown, the incredible technique by Oscar, and that beautiful touch he uses on those ballads. Night Train was that's an album that sticks out in my mind as one of the albums that made me want to be a jazz musician for sure. I'm trying to think of something more recent. I don't know. There's also kind of when I was getting into the organ, there's a kind of a funny old record by Richard Groove Holmes called After Hours, which is an record from the early 60s he made with Joe Pass on guitar and Lawrence Marble on drums. And that's a killer record, too. That was kind of the first thing that introduced me to the jazz organ. It's funny, it wasn't through Jimmy Smith. It was through this old Richard Groove Holmes album. And still to this day, I listen to that record and I play tunes from that record. So that's another kind of one that's a little less well known, but that had a big influence on me.
Well, let's paint with a broader stroke here. Who would you consider your jazz heroes? People that you really dig and look up to?
Are we saying living or past or anybody or?
Yeah, anybody in the realm of jazz and hit your eardrum.
I would have to say Johnny, this pianist I mentioned earlier, Johnny O'Neill, is certainly one of my heroes. Not only does he have just this incredible musicianship and incredible time feel, but he's also just a great performer. He's not afraid to mix humor into his act. He sings the hell out of these tunes, these beautiful old standards that nobody does anymore, and he'll sing these kind of heartbreaker ballads, and he'll literally make people in the room start crying. He has that ability to make them laugh or to make them cry, and it's great. There's fewer and fewer people in the music these days who are able to sort of stay true to the tradition and keep all that musical quality and depth in there, but then at the same time get that real kind of emotional content in what's going on and really make people feel, what's happening. It's not an intellectual exercise. He's putting an incredible amount of feeling and emotion into those performances. So he's a hero of mine. I kind of follow him around New York as much as I possibly can. Vaughn Freeman certainly was a hero to me, partly just because of his sheer individuality, how he wasn't at all afraid to play like himself. Whether people loved it or hated it, he was completely dedicated to playing like he felt and playing who he was. And then also for his and actually both of those guys, Vaughn and Johnny, are incredibly supportive, or were incredibly supportive of younger musicians. Both of those guys could have played with anybody, could have picked up anyone for their bands, and yet they both seem to consistently pick up young guys in their 20s and sort of bring them into their band and train them and sort of teach them the old ways of the music. They're both kind of running their own sort of mini jazz messengers, just educating dozens and dozens of young players and really keeping the music going that way.
So you've been around these storied kind of luminary cats that have laid down such emotion with their music. What exactly are you trying to say with your music?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that's always something that we're continually trying to figure out, that I'm always still searching for. Basically, I think I had put out a piano trio CD on the Max Jazz label a couple of years ago. And I remember thinking the same thing at the time. I said, well, I kind of put together this collection of tunes, and I'm not one that's really like trying to reinvent the wheel of jazz, and I write some compositions I enjoy composing, but I also just love playing old standards. And I was sort of looking at this question of tunes, and I said, well, what is it that all this stuff really kind of has in common? I'm a pretty traditionalist kind of player. I basically, I kind of just try to make music that I would want to listen to and that I think other people would want to listen to. And basically the three main things that sort of drew me to jazz in the first place and that I try to always make sure are part of my playing. One is about the swing feel, man. For me, like a good swing feel, and it's been said a million times, but a good swing feel, if you start with that, that's the starting point, basically. And a lot of people say, people are mixing jazz with hip hop and all this other kind, and like funk and all this kind of stuff. And, some people are out there and say, oh, swing's dead. Swing's from, was back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and nobody wants to do that anymore. But I'm telling you, if you go hear Johnny O'Neill do a trio set, when he starts in from that first tune, his swing feel is so good that everybody in the room immediately perks up and pays attention and starts tapping their foot and just feeling good. So like that great swing feel is kind of step number one. Step number two, I mean, I love melody. I love beautiful melody. I love melodic improvisation. So I gravitate towards players who, you know, aren't improvising just by throwing a bunch of sort of academic patterns or licks over things. I mean, I want to hear guys that are improvising by creating melodies over those songs. You know, stuff that you could theoretically sing if you wanted to. I mean, you listen to like a Gene Ammons solo or something like that, and I mean, you can sing every note that guy's playing. There's nothing that's thrown in there that's superfluous or you know, where he's just trying to show off. And then the third element, and this is kind of, I guess, coming from the Chicago thing, is there's got to be a big dose of the blues in there too. And again, this is something that a lot of musicians pay lip service to, and everybody says, "Oh yeah, the blues, you gotta have the blues in there." But there's not that many people, I feel like, who do it with like the right feeling and really kind of authentically actually get into that kind of feeling and that kind of bag, you know. So for me, that's kind of what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to create music that I would want to listen to, that I think other people would want to listen to, and that has those three kind of elements: that swing feel, melodic-based improvisation, and then a healthy dose of the blues in there too.
Right on. So let's say you leave a club late one night. They're in the heart of Manhattan, and you have a jazz DeLorean that's sitting out front idling, and you can go in and you can punch in any coordinate and go to any show in the history of jazz. Where are you going to go, and who are you going to watch?
Ooh, that's tough. Yeah, it's funny. I haven't thought that much about that kind of thing, but let's see. Now that you put me on the spot, that's a tough one. I would say I would either, let me give a couple answers. I'd probably either jump back to the early 60s, like 1960, 61, 62, and go check out the Oscar Peterson Trio over at the London House in Chicago. I mean, they used to have weekly residencies there, and you could just go and sit night after night after night and check out Oscar's Trio, just doing their thing. I mean, I would absolutely love to have been there. Yeah. I wish I could have made it back to go hear Clifford Brown and Max Roach. That's a band that's definitely up at the top of the list that I would have loved to hear. I mean, you talk about melodic improvisation, it doesn't get any more melodic than Clifford Brown, really. Yeah. And let's see, a third third one, it would actually probably be a blues gig. I'd probably jump back to the late 50s, and maybe go check out some B.B. King. Or maybe there's a great record, B.B. King live at Cook County Jail. I would have loved, I mean, if I could have just hung out there and been a fly on the wall for that show, I would have left something there for that one too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's timely, very timely too.
Yeah.
So let's say we hook back up here in 10 years and we talk. What are you going to be happy to tell me happened?
Well, I'll be happy to tell you that I've been working and touring with my own groups more and more, that I've been getting the chances to play overseas in Japan and Europe, running my own groups. I'll be happy to tell you that I've been singing more and more. I'm working that into my repertoire and singing on more and more of my own gigs here around New York, and you know, eventually I'd like that to really become a major part of my, you know, my music creation and what I do. Hopefully I will have moved into a slightly nicer apartment here somewhere in New York or elsewhere, because I'll be doing a little bit better. But yeah, I mean, as long as music is still a central part of my life and I'm getting a chance to play, you know, the music I love with great musicians and hopefully be able to make a little money and perform for some people who get into it, then I'll be a happy man.
So speaking of happiness, what is the greatest thing about waking up every day?
Well, it's two things, I guess. Well, the unpredictability of it. I mean, for one, the jazz world is never really predictable. You never know quite what's going to happen. I was hanging out just the other night at a club in the Village, and the singer I worked with came running in, and he said, "Hey man, you know, the club across the street, some band didn't show up. I need you to come over and play." And then boom, you're running across the street, and you know, you got a gig you didn't know you were going to have. Or last summer I was out in Chicago, and I suddenly got a call from Bobby Broom, the guitar player Bobby Broom, and he said, "Hey, can you leave with me in about 2 weeks and go on the road for 3 months to go open up for Steely Dan on their nation tour. And
Wow.
I said, yeah, let me see what I can do. And then, before I knew it, 2 weeks later, I was off for 3 months traveling and playing with Steely Dan. I mean, this business, you never really quite know what's going to come your way. So there's that, and then just knowing that you're going to be able to wake up and spend your day creating music with great musicians who love their craft and who perform at a very high level. That always is exciting for me to get up knowing that I'm going to have a chance to do that.
Yeah. So let's say that you have an audience member that watches one of your performances and they want to get to know Ben, and they could go and put your name in Google and pull up the immaculate Twitter explanation or summation of who you are. You have 144 characters. Tell the world who you are in the beauty of brevity and all the tastefulness that goes into it.
Well, that's tough. I don't use Twitter, so I'm not too used to compressing things down to that, or I don't even have a great sense of what that space limitation actually is. But I guess, let's see, what would I say? I would say I'm a jazz and blues musician living in New York, doing my best to spread joy and happiness and share a more profound experience with people than you find in everyday life by playing the music I love and just trying to explore and become the best musician I can be, to do that as well as I can. The least I can come up with.
You need to run out and get a Twitter account now.
Yeah, maybe I should, yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Have a good day, man.
Hey, thank you, Joe. It's great to meet you, man.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over America, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Ben Paterson for his music and quality time. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or you can always visit theneonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.